Okay, before I start this video, there's a few things that I want to address. You might think that the title is a bit of a jab at Jacob, but the truth is his video was a huge source of inspiration for me. And without that video, I would have never have experienced this dimension of hunting or engaged with the kind of discourse that surrounded his video at the time that it was released. I would have never created my wonderful series of streams where I played through the village portion of Dose, and this video certainly wouldn't exist. I have nothing but respect for what Jacob has contributed to the Monster Hunter community, and if you haven't seen it, definitely check out his video. I'll link it in a card here, but if you don't see it, I'll leave it in a link in the description below. Now that's out of the way, allow me to provide some context for this video. You can watch this video in any order. I have timestamps in the description below. I understand this video is long, but I encourage you to take your time with it and return to it when you are able to, or even just look up the sections that interest you the most. By the way, if you want the TLDR, check out the Adaptation timestamp and watch from there. In my personal opinion and bias, I believe you'll appreciate it more if you watch the other sections, but I would also encourage you to approach the video however you like, because I don't know you, so I won't attempt to control how you wish to experience this video. My inspiration for this format of video comes from Tim Rogers, whose current channel is Action Button on YouTube. Now, at the current stage of my journey as a content creator, I couldn't possibly live up to his standards, but I'm just giving credit where credit is due. Now, if you haven't heard of Tim, definitely check him out because you've been missing out. If you want to experience a life-changing review of a video game you've never played or heard of, check out Action Button's review of Boku no Natsuyasumi. A link to his channel and that video in the description below. Now, a main theme in this video addresses difficulty in video games, but I think Monster Hunter Dose presents a different kind of difficulty that you may not be used to hearing in videos of this nature. I hope you'll give me the time of day to explain why this is throughout my video, and above all, I hope you enjoy it and hopefully have an interesting conversation about it. And with that out of the way, let's get right into it. Hey, the name's Cruel, that's King Rob Rule, and welcome to my review of Monster Hunter Dose. I have a somewhat complicated relationship with this game. At some points, I find it absolutely amazing, and at other points, I wonder to myself, why did I put myself through this? Monster Hunter Dose is an incredibly difficult and inaccessible game, which I would absolutely not recommend to anyone first starting their Monster Hunter journey, or even have 1 or 2 Monster Hunter titles under their belt. Hell, I have a hard time justifying a recommendation to any kind of game enjoyer. Every tedious, bothersome, and downright infuriating mechanic you can think of within the Monster Hunter franchise has been put under the microscope and multiplied many times over in this game. Yet, there is a certain charm to this game that no other Monster Hunter game has delivered, at least not in this way. And the game has been proven to be worthy of extensive debate and discussion, for better or for worse. Look no further than Jacob's review of Monster Hunter Dose for proof of that. In fact, without that video, I likely would have never committed to a playthrough of this game, and this video wouldn't exist. So, thank you, Jacob. Thank you for the hell that I experienced. But seriously, what Monster Hunter Dose offers is without question lacking from modern Monster Hunter games. Where the focus of more modern Monster Hunter games are the monster encounters, Monster Hunter Dose doubles down on the hunter element of the game to create more of a hunting simulator. In Monster Hunter DOS, there is much more emphasis on gathering, grinding, planning, and being 100% aware of not only the monster, but the time of year, time of day, and what is possible during these unique times. In doing so, hunting monsters is 50%, maybe even as low as 40 or 35% of the actual game. Right there, most of the modern Monster Hunter fanbase is lost. Because what many of the newer fans enjoy is the excellent action and the combat loop in the newer titles. While there is definitely action to be had in Monster Hunter DOS, it's dialed way back. It's much slower, much more methodical, and far less frequent. Hunting larger than life, hard to beat monsters is still a defining aspect of DOS, but the pacing is slowed down in an attempt to make you feel more like a hunter. I'll go into more detail about this throughout the review, but one thing I would like to bring up first is the topic of difficulty in games. The reason I want to discuss difficulty in games is because people famously refer to DOS, and particularly Generation 1 and 2 of Monster Hunter in general, as notoriously difficult games. However, I would argue that they're not difficult to play per se, but more so difficult to stick with. In terms of actual inputs and the speed at which you need to input them to achieve satisfactory results, the bar is quite low. Sure, the control scheme is a little more than unconventional, but once you're accustomed to it, I dare say it's even easier than Monster Hunter World and Rise. In terms of combat, what makes this game difficult is a combination of many factors, of which I'll be outlining in this video. I choose to focus on these aspects because all of these features are going to be barriers to entry to many players. And if you want to make an informed decision about whether or not you play this game, then I believe you ought to know what you're getting into. The factors I believe that combine to make this game a hard sell to most audiences would be the language barrier, controls, overall jank, the constant repetition of gathering, the seasons mechanic, the obnoxious small monsters, the absurd walls you hit in the early game, and how the game demands that you adapt or fail. I will provide timestamps for whatever sections you wish to visit, or you can go ahead and watch them all. It's up to you. However, if after watching this full review and you still want to play, then this game will be a blast for you and probably the biggest challenge you have ever faced as a hunter up to this point, even in low rank. When I overcame the major hurdles of this game, the emotions I felt had been almost unparalleled in terms of achievement within a game. But anyway, let's dive right into the review with one of the first glaring issues with this game, the language barrier.
こんにちは。日本語を話せる場合は、このセクションを飛ばしても構いません。あなたには当てはまりません。あなたが日本人で会話をスキップしない限り、その場合は、すべてを読み、何もスキップしないように注意してください。OK。これで全ての日本語話者は自由にスキップできます。
As you may have noticed from watching the review so far, there is an English translation of the game available. However, this is a fan-made patch, with only the most vital parts of dialogue and text shown. Also, due to the limited amount of spaces provided for English text, you may have to relearn much of what you understand of items in terms of the Monster Hunter universe. For example, fire herbs are now Dracana, thunderbugs are Vault bugs, and flash bugs are glow bugs. While this isn't such a big deal at first, many of the combinations for items are different from other games, and plenty of trial and error is needed to find out what works. There isn't much to speak of in terms of easy to access online guides though, some of which are also limited in how much is provided in English. I'll leave some links below for some of the best resources I have found that helped me on my playthrough, but they weren't easy to come by and they certainly weren't as helpful as some of the mobile apps used when I played games like 4 Ultimate, World, and Generations Ultimate. However, I do plan to make a beginner's guide for Monster Hunter Dose after this review goes live. But that all depends on how well this video does, of course. If there's no demand, I'll leave it alone because I have many other projects in the works that actually do have demand. But with everything I've explained so far, the translation woes don't end there. There is some baffling specific info that NPCs give to you in the village that informs you on how to advance the story. However, a lot of this hasn't been translated. In fact, I would have been hard stuck in this game if I wasn't live streaming it and had people spoon feeding me the info on how to advance the main story. What I'm describing here aren't just tasks that can be achieved by simply playing the game. I would argue that without proper instruction, anyone would have met the same fate as me without a guide or some other form of external help. For example, one way to progress the story is to give the Veggie Elder a chipped Kushala Daora scale. Something you can't even find outside the reward screen of a Kushala Daora hunt. Not many people are going to be going into a quest with this specific, very specific item on hand, let alone be willing to hand it over to this decrepit, stingy Veggie Elder in hopes of receiving something good in return. I mean, it's a game about hoarding. I don't want to hand over a material that came off a dragon I just fought. I could need that. But there you have it. Apparently, it's quite clear you need to do that if you can read Japanese. Well, if you read the text that told you about it. But this is one of the few examples of specific vital details of story progression being behind a lack of a translation. This will happen a handful of times throughout your playthrough, and while it's only a handful, without help or guidance, you will pretty much be hard stuck, unable to advance the game with next to no clues on how to progress. Naturally, this will likely leave you frustrated, and hopefully some of the information I provide can help others. But those are the problems with translation. One day, these will be addressed in an updated patch. But for now, it's a bit rough for us non-Japanese speaking folk. If you've watched my previous videos on the OG Monster Hunter and Monster Hunter Freedom Unite, you would know about how unique old school Monster Hunter controls can be. But for those that don't know, the inputs for attacking are mostly mapped to the right analog stick, where the camera controls are mapped to the D-pad. The result of this is what Monster Hunter vets refer to as the claw grip. And I'll tell you, it's not comfortable. In fact, I refuse to play this way, opting to instead move my left thumb off the left stick, halting my movement to adjust the camera when needed. And I finished the game this way. It's possible. But I digress. For us Western folk, this control scheme is completely backwards and makes no logical sense. But in Japan, these controls were more common in games at the time than you might think. Let's just be thankful they changed it to right analog stick camera controls in the more modern games. But as I said, once you get past the camera control, the right analog attack inputs are frankly quite easy, surprisingly intuitive, and give more of a sense of weight to the weapons, making you feel every lunge towards the monster. For example, with the longsword, I approach the monster and launch into an overhead swing by pressing the right stick forward. This forward motion on the stick mirrors the motion that the hunter is displaying, immersing me in the feeling of swinging the sword. Each swing feels deliberate and far more effective than the effect that pushing a button gives. When I link the combo with an uppercut by pressing the analog stick inwards, the abrupt motion of the strike is just as abrupt as the motion to forcibly click in the stick, also mirroring the feeling of what the hunter on screen is projecting. When I fade slash away by pulling the right analog stick back, I again am immersed in the motion that the hunter is doing on screen. As I pull back the stick, the hunter pulls back his sword and jumps back. It's simple, but unexpectedly effective and satisfying. Sword and Shield is also an excellent example of feeling the weapon's flow. Pushing forward starts a combo that can be strung together, and you can end it in a spin by flicking the stick to the right, mirroring the spin attack of the hunter on screen. The style of weapon control is something I never saw myself advocating for, but after immersing myself in this game for many hours, I began to appreciate it for what it achieves in its own right. However, I can't say the same for ranged weapons. While you can still cheese monsters with ease via the use of ranged weapons, the satisfaction of wielding them is honestly pitiful. You can't freely aim with them while moving, controlling the reticle is tedious and far too sensitive, and every shot requires a right stick click input. That's R3 if you don't catch my drift. It's not great. Overall, I managed to appreciate the controls of this game to some extent, but there's no denying that things are better the way they are with the current state of Monster Hunter games. There's no doubt in my mind that the control scheme of this game is going to scare a good percentage of players off. But don't worry, if that hasn't done it yet, there's a good chance something else will. Let's start with the Jank. One of the most egregious issues with Monster Hunter DOS and early Monster Hunter in general are the hitboxes. Anyone who has experienced the older games will understand the pain of massive hitboxes in the first and second generation Monster Hunter. It is commonplace for you to be hit by attacks that seem to be meters away from the monster's physical body, or you may get hit with the full force of an attack that seemed to barely scratch you. Pair this with the fact that getting hit in this game can often add to you being endlessly comboed by the monster. It isn't a fun feeling. It leads to apathy and...
Apathy is death. Worse than death. Because at least a rotting corpse feeds the beasts and insects.
Apathy is death.
Apathy is death.
For a game that seems to encourage a careful, patient and planned approach to its game philosophy, it seems counterintuitive that you are punished for demonstrating these tactics. I say this because even when you believe that you have mastered a monster's moveset and have carefully planned your positioning in respect to the monster's attack, to be hit by some invisible force nowhere near that attack, the result feels about as cheap as a copy of Anthem from your local game store. What makes it worse is that while the hitboxes on monsters' attacks are massive and unpolished, Capcom have seemed to tune the tightness of your weapon hitboxes to such an extent that sometimes it feels like the attacks phase right through the monster. While I'm sure this was not an intentional gameplay mechanic and simply teething problems in the early experimenting of the Monster Hunter formula, the result still feels unfair. It feels really bad. Awful, in fact. This is the kind of game where any mistake can lead to a swift and brutal death. And when it's not just the fierce monsters that are against you, but the programming of the game, it can feel hopeless. Not to mention outright maddening. But it's not just hitboxes that will frustrate you in the game. The walls are also your enemy. Now, why would walls be your enemy, you may be thinking? One might assume that being pressed up against a wall could lead to a situation where you get juggled and comboed to an inevitable doom. And to you, I say, correct. But also, no. Well, that's not the worst of it, I should say. No, any wise hunter would know not to corner themselves for such a setup, especially in a game as brutal as this. But it goes deeper than this. The walls in DOS have a secret power, a debuff, if you will, that completely and utterly annihilates any hope of camera control and perspective. If you find yourself near any wall, near the monster or not, and start rotating your camera will start going inside the wall, changing perspective completely until you get your ass away from it. Even just standing near a wall can force your camera into some wacky position, completely throwing you off. And you will know the pain of not having control of your camera, let me tell you. If your eyes aren't fixed on that monster at all times, you are through. I tell you, through. It always happens at the worst of times too, so you need to be hyper aware of your surroundings so as not to put yourself in a situation where that might happen. This can be tricky though, as monsters just love to do endless charging attacks at you, where sometimes the best strategy is to just bait the monster into charging at a wall so you can lock them there and attack them. Yet you somehow have to manage doing this and not getting caught in a camera trap. There's this constant battle of risk and reward going on, and I don't mean in terms of actual game mechanics, but the jank of the game itself. This is a good segue into the next kind of jank, which is timeouts. You can't ever get as many hits in as you like in DOS, because you know how obnoxious the hitboxes can be, and there are often frame 1 monster attacks. Frame 1 with absolutely zero tells. So you need to get out of there fast. But you also know that if you don't attack enough, you will run out of time. And before you ask, the times for the hunt in the games are all 50 minutes. And no, monster health pools aren't even that high. But when you basically have no attack buffing skills, pathetic equipment, and monsters with openings that are exceptionally difficult to exploit, it can be a genuine challenge to complete a hunt on time, especially in the early game, even for a well-versed, experienced hunter, like myself. Not to mention the fact that monsters can notoriously start wandering the map for half the hunt, winding down the time while you do laps of the map failing to track it down. Sure, you can paintball them to keep track of them, but somehow they famously seem to drop the paintball right at the end of the encounter and leave before you get the chance to reapply. This can be especially painful with monsters like Blangonga that have the ability to shake the paint off them, forcing you to reapply over and over. Timeouts can lead to some tense moments, and beating the quest right on time can feel rewarding, but perhaps more of a relief than anything. I just think with everything this game forces you to deal with, jank and all, it is especially painful to see an hour of your time just disappear for essentially nothing at all. Now, this issue isn't exclusive to DOS. This was a factor that has existed in basically all Monster Hunters until Generation 4. But what makes this especially punishing in DOS is due to its resource management system. This resource management system is based around the seasons. Unlike any Monster Hunter before or after it, Monster Hunter DOS features a seasonal mechanic which is core to the gameplay loop. There are 3 seasons in DOS: summer, winter, and breeder. Each of these seasons have day and night cycles. The seasons of the time of day dictate many core aspects of the game, whether it be what monsters are available, what items can be gathered, which maps can be accessed, and what zones on maps are available. On paper, this sounds like a unique and fascinating feature. You might try and pitch this game to a friend by saying, "Hey man, have you heard of that Monster Hunter DOS game? It has seasons in it, and it changes what you do every time of year. It's super immersive." And I wouldn't be shocked if you sold them on it. I could imagine them saying, "Whoa, that does sound cool." However, in practice, this gameplay mechanic can be irritating in its restrictive nature, and in more ways than one. You will need to remember that you cannot gather herbs for healing potions at nighttime. Honey cannot be gathered at all during winter, and even the recipes for your meals will change depending on the season. The meal system for this game overall leaves me speechless. It is offensive regarding how overwhelming it can be. There is no hint to which foods work together for positive effects. And if you choose wrong, you can handicap yourself for the hunt by giving yourself a negative food effect. You might think a simple solution to this would be a guide, and I found one. However, when I learned just how many recipes there are, and the fact that they would change with every season, in the end, I decided to cut my losses, not eat meals, and just do my best to wing it. In saying all this, there are workarounds to dealing with the seasons. For a fee, you can take a nap to change the time of day. or you can pay extra for a long sleep to change the seasons. When you have a lot of hours under your belt and a large stack of money, this is a non-issue. But in the early game, 800 Zenny is quite expensive to pay consistently due to the low reward money and the high cost of gear and items in relation to those early monetary rewards. It also makes me question, if this is going to be a simulator style hunting game with seasons and day-night cycles that affect gameplay, why introduce a mechanic that allows you to bypass it? It's almost as if the developers were completely aware of how frustrating it was. In any case, the time of day and year is going to affect everything in Dose. Let's say the time of year is summer and you want to fight a daimyo hermitor in the desert. Well, you can't go to the desert in summer because it's too hot. So you may as well prepare by gathering honey, since when it hits winter, honey will be unavailable, so why not stock up? However, you get to winter and turns out there is no daimyo quest available during the day or night, so you sleep until breeder and then you fight daimyo. At that point, you just hope you have enough resources to fight him as many times as you need to, or you will need to repeat that arduous process all over again. Monster Hunter is known for its cycle of repetitive actions, but this game dials it up to 9,000. Where Monster Hunter Rise focuses on the action of hunting a monster, Monster Hunter Dose focuses on the preparation for the hunt. This mechanic is charming in its own right, but it does end up becoming exhausting, especially if you fail. This is something I will expand upon further in the section The Plesioth, but for now, I'm going to dive more into the gathering, grinding aspect of Dose. Most Monster Hunter games people are familiar with have some kind of passive item generation mechanic baked into the game somewhere. Whether it be the various farms, argosies, ancient trees and what have you, there is almost always some way of getting loads and loads of whatever you need, usually honey, passively, without having to physically go out and get it. Monster Hunter Dose says to hell with that. In Dose, you must go out on a quest every time you need to gather any kind of material you may need, while also respecting whatever season it may be at the time. Notice how I say quest and not expedition. There are no expeditions, small monster slaying quests, or egg delivery quests in Dose. In fact, there is only one gathering quest in the entire game, and that is to collect 5 special mushrooms, and it is only located in the jungle. Every other quest in this game is a large monster hunt of some description. This isn't to say you need to hunt a large monster every time you need a handful of blue mushrooms, but it will increase the rewards you receive at the end of it. The most efficient way of gathering in Dose is by completing subquests. Most quests in this game have some kind of subquest which you can turn in to end a quest early, which all have unique objectives and rewards. Remember how I said there were no egg quests? Well, there are still egg delivery objectives in the game, but they have been delegated to subquests, making them completely optional. Other examples of subquest objectives include the slaying of certain monsters, breaking large monster parts, or delivery of specific items. This way, the player has the freedom to choose any given quest on a particular map with predictable parameters when gathering. Meaningful decision making and/or choices is one aspect of gameplay that Monster Hunter Dose excels at, and this is a prime example of that. If you want to farm Macholite ore in the swamp, but don't want to deal with a pesky Gypsaros or Kezu, you have the option to select a Kongalala quest, where you can quickly farm your ore and simply slay 4 Kongas to hand in the quest. Heck, even go for 8 if you want more rewards. Eventually, you will become familiar to the point of instinctual with these static quests, and you will know exactly where to find all these gathering spots and monster spawn locations, allowing you to complete them with speed. Subconsciously, this makes you feel more attuned with nature within the game and more like a hunter that has earned that title. This is a rewarding experience, one that is achieved through hardship. But what kinds of rewarding experiences aren't? While we're on the topic of gathering, I'll also point out how obscure gathering can be in DOS. Don't get me wrong, I'd rather gather in DOS over Monster Hunter 1 any day, but it still comes with its struggles. Gathering nodes blend into the environment like you wouldn't believe. If I didn't have a HD filter on my emulator, I don't know how I would have managed gathering in this game. Even with the HD environments, you would be forgiven for missing some of these well-hidden gathering nodes. Take for example mining points, which are simply a crack in the wall. In any other game, you would just consider this as a feature of the wall, and the only way you would ever know you could mine there is by walking right up to it with your mining pick selected. There's no other prompt there. Bugs blend into trees. Herbs and mushrooms blend into the grass. And don't even get me started with frogs. The game will have the gall to tell you that the gathering point is used up, but if you move slightly to the right, bam! 8 more frogs collected. It takes a trained eye to spot these gathering spots, but this is one of the instances where I believe this was done by design, not by accident. Learning where everything is through trial and error can feel like small victories here and there, but once you learn everything, it adds up to one massive feeling of discovery and accomplishment. Until you reach that point, I recommend you spam the circle button everywhere you walk until you know what to look for. As for the grinding aspect of the game, the grindiness goes much further than you might think. If you've been paying attention to the video, you probably see where this is going, but there is an additional factor I haven't mentioned yet that plays a big role in this, and that is rewards. In this case, I'm going to do a little bit of show, not tell. This is an example of a typical rewards screen in Monster Hunter DOS. Not much, right? Here's the monetary reward. Well, consider everything I've told you up to this point, the length of the hunts, the restrictions on the time of day and year, the sheer amount of preparation required for a hunt. It all adds up to a massive time sink. But that's not all. Take a look at this longsword tree. This weapon took an ungodly amount of time for me to upgrade. While the cost is outrageously expensive, considering the amount of zenny you get per quest, that is nothing compared to the materials required to upgrade it. Every time I saw the amount of Makalite ore needed to upgrade this goddamn sword, I think my mind broke a little. At the time, I thought my best route for obtaining Makalite ore was doing mining runs of the swamp via the cave. On a good run, I might get, say, 5. Sometimes I'd get as little as 1 or 2. Sometimes none. 0. Nada. Capiche. Each quest would take me about 10 minutes to complete if I was fast, but I don't even want to disclose how many times it took. I don't like to relive trauma. It's still not fully upgraded. I'm about here on the tree. This is all for one piece of equipment. So pair all this with the fact that certain maps can't be accessed at certain times of year. You'll need to be constantly gathering as well so you don't run out of items. It's clear that you'll have an extensive grind fest on your hands. But there's also another factor that makes this grind particularly intolerable. The early game is probably the hardest point in the whole game, much harder than the fight with Kushala Daora. Heck, even harder than fighting Lunastra. You'd think at the start, a game should be easy and then ramp up the difficulty later. But no, I firmly believe the biggest challenge of this game is at the beginning. The equipment you have to work with at the start is a key reason for this. What you start off with is so bad, it takes as long as 20 minutes to defeat a Velocidrome, which is crazy because you can craft great swords later on that can potentially 2 to 3 shot these guys. But in your early game attempts, it's mental how long it takes to take him down. Thankfully, chat told me about an overpowered bone hammer I could craft to get me through the early game, which worked wonders, but without that information and the knowledge of how to find the materials for it, I could have been grinding for way longer. This thing wasn't pretty either, and it got memed on pretty heavily, but gosh darn did it get the job done. But that didn't stop me from taking crazy amounts of damage with the pathetic excuse for armor provided at the start of the game either. Another thing, upgrading your armor is a complete time waster in this game. Sure, you can get some stat boosts out of it, but the defense increase you receive for all the extra materials you need to put into it is completely negligible. Yes, you heard me correctly. Extra materials. Upgrading your armor in this game is almost like rebuilding an armor set from scratch. Armor spheres? Not a thing in this game. My recommendation is to skip that process altogether, and if you need stronger armor, just craft an entirely new set from a higher tier monster and leave it at that. It's not worth the hassle to upgrade. However, once I was able to craft the Rathian set, I gained, in my eyes, the most valuable skill in the game. Health boost, which allowed me to take additional hits from monsters. I could also stop worrying about meals because I was only using those for health boosts anyway. The Rathian set carried me through the entire main campaign up to Lunastra, so I would definitely recommend it if you're going to try this game for yourself. But believe it or not, we haven't even begun talking about the real enemy at hand. What, were you expecting an Elder Dragon or something? Ha! You idiot! Those guys aren't close to the greatest obstacle in this game, far from it. It's actually these guys. If you've never played an old school Monster Hunter game, you will notice this immediately. The aggression levels of these smaller monsters is absolutely off the charts. Now, is it as bad as Monster Hunter 1? No, probably not. I'd say that game was even more relentless regarding the small monster tenacity. But let's be honest, the bar was set pretty low for overall playability in that game. However, whether you are entering a fight with a monster or simply gathering some materials, these little guys will be out to destroy you. You will end up learning pretty quick you need to clear these guys out before doing anything, or get painfully interrupted or even comboed to oblivion. Nature is not only uncaring in this game, it freaking hates you. Now, the reason I titled this section Crabs is because they were one of the worst types of monsters to deal with in my playthrough on stream. When I refer to crabs, I mean small hermitors and cyanotors. Not the big dudes, they were easy in comparison. No, I mean the little guys. No joke. In fact, they were such an obstacle for me that during my stream, viewers would meme on the difficulty I had with them and how they were the real enemy. One of my lovely viewers, Wolflord, even drew me a hilarious picture of me exacting my revenge on these little punks. That's the same bone hammer I described earlier that got me through a lot of the early game, by the way. Anyway, these crabs rubbed me the wrong way for a variety of reasons. For one, they wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. They were often hidden underground and spawned right under you when they were ready to attack. A visible enemy is one you can deal with. It may be large and terrifying, but you can prepare for it. With the right strategy, you can overcome it. An invisible enemy, on the other hand, is like anxiety or fear. It can't be seen, and it may not be loud or imposing. Some can be, sure, but many enemies of this kind break you down in more subtle ways. This was my precise experience with the small crabs in Monster Hunter Dose. Once they get that first attack in, you're stunned. Then they zoom around you 180 degrees before you even get the chance to recover and get you again. People say the new games are too anime. Well, let me tell you, the crabs in Dose have that Dragon Ball Z crap down pat. Attack! Boom! I'm behind you now. Attack! Boom! I'm behind you again. Oh, what's that? You're trying to run? I'm going to chase you down at the speed of sound and not relent until you are decimated. You may be thinking, yeah, crabs are like this in every game. Well, I'm going to add a little context to this to help you understand. Your equipment is pathetic, so you take a scary amount of damage. This includes weaponry, by the way, so keep that in mind. Combine this with the fact that they are hyper aggressive in this entry, and the result is an army of fearsome, deadly, near unstoppable foes. In the early to mid game, you're going to take a lot of damage from these guys, and they're going to take a lot of hits to kill as well, unless you're using a greatsword and you have your timing down to a T. Now picture that struggle with not just one, but two, hey, in some cases, 3 or 4 of these guys absolutely bum rushing you. Now you think that's scary? How about we add a Plesioth into the mix? Yeah, nightmare fuel. I don't want to give the impression that the crabs were the only aggravating small monsters in the game. It could easily be argued that some are worse, but I think you have somewhat of an idea of what to expect from this game now in terms of small monsters. If you have any horror stories of small monsters in Dose, or Gen 1 and 2 in general, be sure to share them in the comments and we'll have a laugh. Now, remember the certain monster I just mentioned? Yeah, let's talk about that one. If you are watching this video right now, there's a high probability that you have heard of this guy. Big Boy Plessy has a reputation in this community for having absurd hitboxes, an outright offensive hip check, and some flat out irritating mechanics. Maybe you fought him in GU, perhaps you fished him out in 4U, or maybe you even struggled immensely against him in Freedom Unite. Perhaps you just saw 5,000 threads on Reddit and Twitter about him. The point is, he's a bit of a meme in the community, a loud meme, and he's earned it. Anyway, for context, this was not my first rodeo with Plesioth. I was warned about him in my first Monster Hunter game, Generations Ultimate, and while he was kinda annoying, I didn't really understand the level of hatred thrust upon him. Then when I played Freedom Unite, the fight was completely different, and my ability to deal with him was hindered significantly. But still, not a monster I would consider a hard wall at all in the game. From my experience with Plesioth, I figured, hey, maybe there's just a loud minority of people out there that just need to get good at this particular monster. I mean, you only have to beat him once. It's not like his gear is particularly worth grinding for over anything else. I even watched Jacob's Dose review where he discussed Plesioth at length, but at the time, I was more partial to agree with Jacob on what he was saying about the fight, given my experience with the monster. I mean, I had technically experienced a version of Plesioth for Generation 2. It couldn't be that different, could it? Well, once I had experienced his version of Dose, well, now I have a complete understanding to why people refer to him as the Plesioth. The naming of this section is not by accident. This monster was the defining moment of my entire playthrough. When I really think about it, I don't think a single boss in a video game has sent me on an emotional roller coaster to this degree and tested my limits to such an extent. To put this into context, and many of you may not know this, but I'm approaching 32 years of life on this earth, and I've been playing video games for pretty much as long as I can remember. I never thought that after careful consideration, I'd be concluding that my greatest challenge ever in a game would hands down be a giant, flying, but also walking on land fish. And what's more baffling is that, like I said, I had previous experience with this monster. Plenty of it, in fact. But in the context of Dose, the Plesioth is on a whole other level. The previous challenges still remain. His hitbox is huge. The hip check is near unavoidable to melee users, and well, he's just overall annoying. Now, let me tell you about the Plesioth in Dose. For starters, in Dose, the Plesioth is introduced extremely early on in the game. This hulking giant of a flying fish shows up before the Green Queen herself, Rathian, which is what most Monster Hunter fans are used to being the first proper large wyvern you typically fight, following the smaller stuff like the drones and the cuckoos. Despite this, your first encounter with the Plesioth will likely be before you encounter Blangonga or even Kezu. Now, the reason I say likely is because the way quests are delivered in Dose is extremely nuanced, and I'm not sure I even fully understand it myself, but just know it's possible to hit this incredibly difficult wall terrifyingly early. Your toughest experiences up to this point will likely be Gypsaros or Kongalala, depending on your playstyle. Heck, maybe it's even Yarn Kutku or Cephadrome. My point is, you're nowhere near ready for this, and unless you adapt and get creative, you're gonna have a bad time. So you may be thinking, it's a skill issue, right? Sure, you may have subpar gear, but just get good, right? Well, this is where I will argue, it's not a skill issue, it's a knowledge issue. Sure, the Plesioth has a lot of health, he's hard to get close to, and it's mind-bogglingly difficult to get away from his attacks. There are countless other factors involved in strategizing how to beat the Plesioth in Dose. In Dose, the Plesioth frequently jumps in and out of the water to store you for time. You can counteract this with sonic bombs, but you only have 10, unless you bring crafting materials and combo books which take up valuable inventory space to craft more. Not to mention, and exceptionally frustratingly, sometimes sonic bombs will unexplainably not cause the Plesioth to leave the water, wasting your resources and cause what little patience you had for the fight to dwindle. In Dose, the only other way to get the Plesioth out of the water is by using a frog to fish him out. However, this is not explained, at least not in English, and also, the Plesioth must not spot you, and you must make sure no small monsters can interrupt you during this process. In Dose, as explained previously, you are not just fighting the Plesioth, you are also fighting every small monster in the zone, which have the potential to respawn when you kill them all, and will most definitely all respawn if you leave the zone to follow the Plesioth into another zone, where you must then kill all the small monsters in that zone. In Dose, killing all the small monsters that the Plesioth demands you to uses precious resources. You will either waste whetstones or ammunition, which cost more time in gathering or more money, which is scarce in the early game. In Dose, some of the small monsters you need to kill in these zones are Cephalos, which are notoriously difficult to catch, and if you're impatient like me, will require you to use some of those valuable sonic bombs just to get a chance at hitting them. In Dose, the Plesioth will hit you so hard that unless you play like a god, you are sure to use substantial amounts of healing resources on every attempt, causing you to go on several additional quests to restock your inventory, adding further time to the spent trying to learn the fight. Now, I could go on and on about the Plesioth in Dose, and I suppose I did there, but let me describe to you my specific solution. To defeat the Plesioth, I needed perfect conditions, and from my countless attempts, I found the perfect strategy. The first was fighting the Plesioth at night. I had learned that when I fight the Plesioth at night on the desert map, it would not leave the area. Well, technically, it did leave the area, but it immediately turns around and comes back, every time without fail. The reason for this is that at night time, the only area the Plesioth can flee to is sealed off due to the tide being too high at night. Now, logically speaking, this shouldn't be a problem for a gigantic fish, but since the player can't access the area, I guess the developers decided to throw us a bone. This was ideal for multiple reasons. For one, I could focus on the fight in one big burst, not having to worry about losing time to chasing the Plesioth in between areas. And trust me, I had my fair share of timeouts in the past, so this was a massive win. It was also incredibly important because I could just kill all the small monsters in the area once, and when they were all gone, they would stop respawning for good, not just saving me time, but precious resources. The next step was finding the perfect weapon for the job. I experimented with lance, greatsword, heavy bowgun, bow, and longsword. Yeah, I tried a lot of stuff. But you might be surprised that the weapon that got me through this was a poison sword and shield from the Gypsaros tree. Due to the poison nature of the weapon, I could deal passive DPS, even when the Plesioth retreated to the water where I normally wouldn't be able to do damage, unless of course I was using a ranged weapon. The fast, non-committal attacks of the sword and shield allowed me to deal damage while being able to either consistently get out of trouble quickly or use an emergency block if necessary, which was surprisingly more effective than I thought it would be. My first instinct was that a weapon like the lance might be better suited to tanking the Plesioth's brutal assault, but it simply wasn't fast enough to retaliate in any kind of effective capacity. Another important factor was my preparation. I needed to make sure I brought a full stack of mega potions, and honey for crafting more mega potions later, sonic bombs, materials for crafting more sonic bombs, and the bare minimum of combo books to make sure I didn't waste a thing. Now, you may be thinking, well, this is obvious. Any hunter with experience knows these are basic things before a hunt. But when you understand the grueling grind of gathering resources and funds in Monster Hunter DOS and stack tens of failed attempts on top of that, you can understand how painstakingly patient you need to be to achieve this feat every single time you try again. Did I mention you only have 2 pages of inventory for carrying items, including what you may gather or carve? Well, there's that too. There's one valuable resource that I haven't mentioned yet that I would say is the defining factor and the key to victory in this fight. I mentioned it briefly when describing the Plesioth's fight. Can you guess what it is? It was frogs. As many goddamn frogs as I could carry. You could leave behind anything in this fight. Just don't let it be frogs. I'll explain why in a second, but first, I just want to explain how nuanced this is. Now, frogs aren't something you'll stumble upon by accident in DOS. No, I guarantee it would absolutely have to be an accident. Frogs are found in this specific location on the jungle map of DOS, and only there. You can also gather worms from there, and that might actually be all you find, and you might not even realize if you try again at a later time, you could find frogs. But what's even crazier to me is that it's never explained, at least not in English, and if it was, I never saw it, but the sole purpose of them appears to be fishing out the Plesioth. Now, as a player, you are led to believe it is possible to fish out the Plesioth because it is a side quest objective, so you know you should be able to do it. But how? The only reason I knew to do it was because a helpful individual in my chat during my stream pointed it out to me. However, this was all they told me, and I was unaware of the complexities of doing so. Can I just cast the frog in and the Plesioth will bite? When is the right time to pull the bait up? How do I know if the Plesioth has noticed me without taking substantial damage? The amount of times I tried to use the frog and failed nearly drove me to insanity. But I'm not ashamed to admit it because I honestly believe this mechanic was not communicated to me in an effective way. Whether this was the game's fault or not is yet to be determined, but this could possibly be an issue involving language barrier. But I'm sure in time when the game is translated, and I know it is being translated, that we will find this out. Anyway, back to the value of the almighty frog. The intended use of the frog is to cast it out before the Plesioth has noticed you. In terms of the conditions of this scenario I had carefully constructed, I would wait until the Plesioth had left the zone, and just as the Plesioth re-entered, I would cast out my frog and wait patiently. And trust me, patience is required because it takes a good 30 seconds to a minute before Plesioth will reach the bait. All precious seconds on the clock, but necessary. The next step is critical because if you are unnerved, the Plesioth will scare the absolute shit out of you with a battle cry, tricking you into thinking maybe it's about to attack. But if you hold your ground, you'll find out that this is Plesioth code for me likey froggy. And the next thing you know, swoosh! There goes the frog and it's time to press circle, baby. The first time this happened for me, in that moment, a rush of adrenaline surged through me. The anxiety left my body, and while the camera zoomed out, I saw my hunter fighting tooth and nail to wrangle in this incomprehensibly large fish, the catch of a century. From here, the Plesioth is thrown from the ocean and thrust upon the land. 20 meters away, maybe not the best spot. It could have been closer, but I'll take it, damn it! Let me just say, this is probably the most satisfying moment I've experienced as a gamer. Seeing that stupid, insulting, smug son of a fish get its comeuppance was an endorphin field day. Not only is this an alternative means of reliably getting the Plesioth out of the water, but you also get a free window of damage and applying poison. This method was so effective that now I can reliably complete the hunt in 20 minutes or less. But any other way, and I'd be hard pressed not triple carding or timing out. The amount of critical thinking required to pass this test was like no other challenge I've ever experienced in any video game, and it's not even close. Hopefully I've conveyed that clearly in this section, despite the length, but it's important that I did because I believe this fight in particular taught me about the most important lesson in Monster Hunter Dose, which I will explain now. Well, we got this Gameplay to deal with. The art of adaptation is the key foundation of Monster Hunter Dose. I believe the difficulty of this game is completely intentional, but it's not difficult in a mechanical way, and it's not difficult in terms of the types of inputs the game asks of the player. Except maybe the claw grip, I'll acknowledge that at least. But seriously, this game is not that hard to play. No, the difficulty in Monster Hunter Dose comes from the requirement to think critically. Many games will guide the player, dropping clues, and obvious ones at that, on how to approach each and every situation. People that label themselves as serious gamers often describe this process as hand-holding. I feel this is a derogatory term that is used by people to put themselves in a higher position than those that enjoy that kind of gameplay, at least in their own perception. As if relaxing and turning off your brain is somehow a wrong or inferior way to enjoying the medium. It's bullshit, and I'm calling you out on that if you think that way. However, there is a point to be made that the design philosophy of Monster Hunter Dose fundamentally is going to throw off the majority of players. That's not because the majority of gamers are stupid. I don't believe that. I just don't believe that many people have been asked to approach problems in games this way, at least not to this extreme extent. I expect that when faced with the Plesioth, people's initial reaction will be something along the lines of, "That's way too hard. This fight is unfair. I feel unprepared for this fight," or maybe just straight up, "Wow, I suck at this." All of this, at least in my belief, is a reasonable response to the situation. I've ranted enough about the Plesioth to justify that, but I also believe it's because of unspoken rules of most video games. Many people have been conditioned into the idea that if I just hit this thing enough times and not get hit, I'll be able to beat it. And if it's not that straightforward, there should be some kind of clue, usually quite obvious, on how to approach the situation. But as I explained, this way of thinking does not apply to the Plesioth. The Plesioth does not care about being hit because it can retreat to the water and other zones as much as it likes. quite often resulting in a timeout. The Plesioth does not care about being able to hit you because the only thing more obnoxiously large than its body is its hitbox. The Plesioth throws out everything you have learned from previous games, even previous fights in Dose so far, and says fuck you, figure it out or fail. And this doesn't just apply to the Plesioth. You'll run into this problem again and again in Dose. How the heck do I damage a Bazarios? How do I overcome the Gravios? What's the best and most efficient way to approach the Kushala Daora encounters? And how can I stop a Diablos in its tracks? All of these questions will come to you in your Monster Hunter Dose playthrough the first time. No matter your previous experience with the series, I'd bet money on it. I already spoiled you on how to beat the Plesioth, at least my way, but I'll let you figure out the others for yourself. Equipment and skill will not get you through Dose. It will kinda sorta be a factor in your success, but only a surprisingly small amount. Dose is a game about knowledge. You need to understand how the monster behaves and how to use whatever is available to you at the time to overcome that challenge. And the answer is almost never obvious. Only through trial and many errors will you figure this game out, and oh my, will it punish you for those errors. But anyone who has played a From Software game will tell you that these kinds of challenges give the biggest payoffs. I think this is a good segue into my conclusion. Monster Hunter Dose is an exceptionally challenging game, and as stated previously, it's not challenging in a mechanical way, but in a critical thinking kind of way. I would also argue that it's not just serious critical thinking that is required to get through, but also a high level of perseverance due to that repetitive and grinding nature of the preparation aspect of the game. Dose has no shortcuts. You can't passively generate items like you can in newer titles. If you run out of mega potions, you have no choice but to do some hunts in the jungle to gather honey. And the same goes for money and anything else you may require. When you combined these aspects of punishing encounters with harsh preparation requirements, it's obvious to see why this game is so divisive among players. It's also clear to see why this game did abysmally sales-wise. The majority of people who play games, I would argue, are not interested in an encounter like the Plesioth, at least not in this form, because it feels so insurmountable and the effective path is not spelled out for you. Not only that, but failing the quest over and over is just simply too punishing. Who wants to spend 50 minutes getting timed out by one of the most infuriating creatures of all time just to be told to spend another hour or more gathering and preparing your inventory to try again when in all likelihood you're probably gonna fail again? It's incredibly brutal, and I don't blame anyone that feels this way. If you think that's you, I don't recommend this game. In fact, I would not recommend Monster Hunter Dose to any video game enjoyer because, for the most part, I don't think this game is what I would define as enjoyable. I think Dose is challenging, rewarding, and without a doubt will build your resilience. It also made me into a more effective hunter in general, providing me with a deeper knowledge of the series and fine-tuning my combat senses within Monster Hunter to a fine point. I would compare defeating the main campaign of Dose with the feeling you get when you finally stop bashing your head against a brick wall for 100 hours. There was a feeling of absolute relief and happiness, but that's not to say I didn't experience turmoil and serious mental damage along the way. I am in no rush to ever return to Monster Hunter Dose. The only reason I stuck with it was for the sake of content and because my viewers supported me every step of the way. It would take an unbelievably strong-willed person to get through Dose by themselves with no external support. I just don't think Dose is what I would call fun. It definitely has its moments, and what it tries to do with its overall theme as a hunting simulator is perhaps unmatched in terms of immersion. But this is a niche concept that the majority of people won't be able to get behind, including myself, a man whose passion of Monster Hunter games rivals nothing else in his life other than friends, family, and making content, which is mostly about Monster Hunter at that. In no way am I saying this lightly. However, if you have been able to listen to everything I have covered in this video and you still think you're up for the challenge, then I think you'll love this game. I say this because throughout my journey of playing and learning about Monster Hunter DOS, I've discovered a small but passionate community of people who adore this game like their own child. And you know what? I completely understand this. I understand because what Monster Hunter DOS sets out to achieve, it delivers in spades. Monster Hunter DOS is a hunting simulator game that pits nature against the hunter. The game is supposed to be uncaring and fair because that's how nature is. You may argue that's all well and good, but the Plesioth's hitbox still can't be explained. Well, I can see your point, but also understand that nature has certain rules that must be respected in the same way that this game does. Sure, it may have been unfair that you got hit by the Plesioth's hip check, but those are the parameters we've been given to follow, and we must respect that or fail. As I and many others have discovered, it's only when you accept and respect these rules that you are able to overcome these challenges. And damn, I'm starting to sound alarmingly philosophical about a difficult boss fight against a fish. Let's wrap this up before I get too hyperbolic. If you're the average game enjoyer like me, and you just want the game to be reasonably challenging but still fun, my recommendation is to give this one a miss, at least until it's translated. If you're a special snowflake gamer that wants to show the world that they can beat the game against all odds, go for it. I'm just kidding about the special snowflake bit. But this might just be the punishing challenge you are looking for if you want to test yourself as a hunter or game enjoyer in general. Anyway, that's been the review, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. This video took an exceptionally long time to make, so if you were waiting for it, I hope it was worth it. I've been King Rob Rule, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.
So tasty!